shoreline of faith. Stop misreading Jeremiah 29:11. What God's plan looks like when life feels out of control. The verse you have been quoting to get through your hardest seasons might be the very thing keeping you spiritually stuck. Think about that for a second. The promise you have painted on your wall, posted on your story, whispered to yourself in the dark. What if you have been reading it completely wrong? Not wrong in a way that makes you a bad person. Wrong in a way that has quietly, slowly set you up for a faith crisis you never saw coming. Picture this scene. It is 3 a.m. Someone is lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart racing. Life has come apart in ways they never expected. The job is gone. The relationship is broken. The dream they prayed over for years is nowhere in sight. And in that moment of raw desperation, they reach for their phone and type into Google, "Does God still have a plan for my life?" The first result that appears is Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." They read it, they screenshot it, they feel a brief wave of relief wash over them. And then morning comes and nothing has changed. The circumstances are the same. The silence from God feels the same. And slowly, that verse stops feeling like a promise and starts feeling like a question, one they are afraid to ask out loud. Here is what nobody told them. They found the right verse, but they read it the wrong way. And that difference changes absolutely everything. Today we are not here to make you feel better with a pretty promise pulled out of context. We are here to show you what that promise actually means, what it actually demands, and why the real version, the full, historical, unfiltered version, is infinitely more powerful than anything that fits on a coffee mug or a phone wallpaper. Because when you understand where these words came from, who they were written to, and what God was actually saying in that moment, you will not just feel encouraged for a few hours, you will permanently change the way you walk through every hard season for the rest of your life. And that is exactly what we are going to do right now. The crime committed against this verse. Here is something that should make you stop and think. Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11 is statistically one of the most quoted, most shared, most tattooed verses in the entire Bible. It appears on graduation cards, hospital room walls, wedding invitations, and motivational posters in offices across the world. It has been turned into a brand, and that is precisely where the problem begins. When a verse becomes a brand, it stops being a word and starts being a product. And products are designed to make you feel good, not to tell you the truth. What happened to Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11 over the last few decades is something I can only describe as spiritual gentrification. You know what gentrification does to a neighborhood? It takes something that was raw, real, and deeply rooted in the lives of the people who lived there, and it polishes it up, prices it out, and makes it appealing to people who never had to actually live through what that place represented. That is exactly what consumer Christianity did to this verse. It took a word spoken into one of the darkest, most devastating moments in Israel's history and turned it into a motivational quote. And here is the cost of that. Millions of people are walking around with a version of God's promise that was never designed to carry the weight of real life. Because the version they have been given is clean, it is simple, it is comfortable. It essentially says, God has a plan, the plan is good, and if you believe hard enough, things will work out in your favor. What that produces is what theologians call vending machine theology. You insert your faith, you press the button of prayer, and you wait for the blessing to drop. And when the blessing does not drop, when you pray and nothing changes, when you believe and the situation gets worse, the machine feels broken. And people do not just get disappointed when the machine feels broken. They walk away from God entirely. I have watched this happen. I have sat across from men and women who loved God deeply, who served faithfully, who quoted this verse like a lifeline. And when life did not deliver what they thought the verse promised, they did not just lose their hope, they lost their faith. And I want you to understand something. That is not a personal failure. That is the predictable result of being handed a promise without being given its context. There is a dangerous gap between what we quote and what the text actually says. What we quote is, God has a plan for you. What the text actually says is far more sobering and far more beautiful at the same time. God's plan for you may involve seasons of suffering, years of waiting, and circumstances that look nothing like prosperity. And He is still in complete control of every single detail. The problem is not the verse is extraordinary. The problem is that we have been reading the answer without ever understanding the question God was actually answering when He spoke those words. And you cannot fully grasp the answer until you know the question. So here is what we are going to do. We are going back, all the way back to Babylon 597 years before Christ, to a group of people who had lost everything, to a letter that arrived in a foreign land and changed the course of history. Because once you see what was happening when God said, I know the plans I have for you, you will never read those words the same way again. And more importantly, you will finally understand why that promise was built to hold the weight of the hardest season you have ever lived through. Enter the archive, the world behind the words. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine this. The year is 597 BC. Jerusalem, the city that was supposed to be untouchable, the city where God Himself was said to dwell, is in ruins. The temple that Solomon built, the most sacred structure in the known world, has been ransacked. The streets that once hummed with worship and commerce are now silent, except for the sound of soldiers in chains. And the people being led out of that city in chains are not the weak, the forgotten, or the overlooked. They are the best Israel had. The priests, the scholars, the craftsmen, the leaders, the men and women who represented the intellectual and spiritual heartbeat of an entire nation. Ripped from their homes, marched across hundreds of miles of desert, and deposited in the capital of the most powerful empire on earth, Babylon. Now put yourself in their place, not as a history lesson, but as a human being. You had a life, you had a home, you had a community, a sense of purpose, a future you could picture. And in what felt like a single moment, all of it was gone. You are living in a city that does not speak your language, does not worship your God, and does not care about your pain. And every single day you wake up and ask the same question, how long? That is the emotional landscape into which God speaks, Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. Not into comfort, not into blessing, into devastation. But before we get to verse 11, we need to sit with something that most people skip entirely, because this is where the story gets deeply human. The exiles in Babylon were not sitting quietly in their suffering. They were doing what all of us do when life falls apart. They were listening to whoever promised them the fastest way out. And there were voices, loud voices, voices that sounded prophetic, that carried spiritual authority, that drew crowds. These voices were saying exactly what the exiles desperately needed to hear. Do not settle in. Do not get comfortable. God is about to rescue you. This exile is going to be short. Hold on, because deliverance is right around the corner. Now here is what I need you to understand about those voices, because this is one of the most relevant things in this entire message. Those voices were not necessarily evil people with corrupt motives. They were popular people who told the crowd what the crowd was desperate to believe. They were giving hope. They just were not giving truth. And there is a difference between hope that feels good and truth that actually holds. God, through Jeremiah, called those voices liars. Not kindly misguided, not well-intentioned but mistaken, liars. Because when the stakes are that high, a comforting lie is not compassion. It is cruelty dressed in spiritual language. And then Jeremiah sends a letter, not a vision, not a thunderclap from heaven, a letter written on parchment, carried by messengers across hundreds of miles, delivered to a displaced people in a foreign land. That itself is remarkable. God chose the slowest, most ordinary method of communication available to deliver one of the most important messages in Scripture. And what does the letter say? Read Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 through 7 carefully, because this is where everything shifts. God does not say, "Hold on, rescue is coming." God says, "Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. Pray for the city of your captors. Pray for the prosperity of the empire that destroyed your home." Let that sit with you for a moment, because that instruction is not just countercultural, it is spiritually violent to every natural instinct a human being has. When someone takes everything from you, every fiber of your being wants justice, wants escape, wants God to show up and make things right immediately. And instead, God says, plant a garden, build a house, invest in this place. Pray for these people. Why? Because God was not just managing their circumstances. He was forming their character. He was building something in them that could not be built in comfort, that could not be produced in a quick rescue. He was growing a people who could carry a promise across 70 years of waiting, through generations who would never see the beginning of what they were building toward. And then, only after all of that, after the instruction to settle in, to build, to pray, to invest, to resist the voices of false comfort, only then does God say, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." That changes everything. That verse is not a greeting card. It is a lifeline thrown to people who had been told the truth about how long they would be waiting. It is a promise given not to people on their way up, but to people who had hit the absolute bottom. It is God saying, "I see exactly where you are. I know exactly how this feels, and I am telling you, not from a distance, not with empty comfort, that I have not lost the thread of your story." The promise comes after the process, not instead of it, and that distinction is not a minor theological footnote. It is the entire architecture of how God works in a human life. Because if you only read verse 11, you walk away thinking the plan is about your destination. But if you read the whole letter, you realize the plan is about your formation. God is far less interested in getting you to a comfortable place than he is in making you into a certain kind of person along the way. Now that you know where these words came from, now that you have felt the weight of the context they were born in, here is what I want to do. I want to take that context and bring it directly into your life right now. Because what God said to those exiles in Babylon is speaking to something very specific in your situation today. And the 5 things we are about to walk through are going to permanently reshape the way you understand what God's real plan actually looks like from the inside. The 5 things God's real plan actually looks like. There is a moment in almost every hard season when a person stops asking, "When will this end?" and starts asking a far more dangerous question. Does God even see me? That shift happens when the gap between what we expected and what we are actually living becomes too wide to ignore. And the reason that gap exists for so many believers is that nobody ever taught them what God's plan actually looks like from the inside while you are living through it. Because from the inside, God's plan rarely looks like a plan at all. It looks like confusion. It looks like delay. It looks like doors closing and silence stretching and prayers that seem to bounce off the ceiling. And if your only reference point is Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11 as a motivational quote, you have no framework for what you are experiencing. But if you go back to the full letter, if you sit with the history we just walked through together, 5 things become undeniably clear. And these 5 things are going to give you a framework for your life that no circumstance can take away. The first thing God's real plan looks like is displacement before destination. The exile was not a detour from God's plan for Israel. It was not a pause, not a setback, not God losing control of the situation for a season. The exile was the plan. God told Jeremiah ahead of time that it was coming. He orchestrated the timeline. He chose who would go and what they would carry with them. The most painful chapter in Israel's national story was not an interruption of God's purposes. It was the vehicle through which God's purposes were being accomplished. Now bring that forward into your life today. The season you are in right now, the one that makes no sense, the one you have been praying your way out of for months or maybe years, what if it is not in the way of the plan? What if it is the plan? What if the thing you are most desperate to escape is the very terrain on which God is building something in you that cannot be built anywhere else? Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before he stood before Pharaoh. Joseph spent years in a prison cell before he stood before the throne of Egypt. David spent years running from a king who wanted him dead before he became the king God had anointed him to be. In every case, the displacement was not the enemy of the destiny. The displacement was the preparation for it. God does not always remove you from the wilderness. Sometimes he meets you in it, walks with you through it, and builds in you through it something that the promised land alone could never produce. The second thing God's real plan looks like is faithfulness in the wrong place. One of the most jarring instructions in Jeremiah's letter is the command to seek the welfare of Babylon, to pray for the prosperity of the very city, the very empire, the very system that had caused all of their suffering. This was not a suggestion. This was a divine directive, and it reveals something profound about the nature of obedience. God does not wait for your circumstances to be ideal before he calls you to be faithful. The exiles could have said, "We will worship when we get back to Jerusalem. We will serve when life feels normal again. We will be generous, we will be faithful, we will be fully present when God gets us out of this place." And God's response to that posture through the voice of Jeremiah was essentially no. Be faithful here, be generous here. Seek the good of the people around you here, even the ones who hurt you, even in the city you did not choose, even in the season you would never have asked for. That is one of the most countercultural and spiritually demanding truths in all of Scripture. Because what it means for you is this: the place you are in right now, even if you did not choose it, even if it feels foreign to everything you hoped your life would look like, is not a spiritual waiting room where your real life is on pause. It is your actual life. And God is calling you to bloom where you are planted, even if you never chose the soil, even if the soil feels hostile, even if you cannot yet see what is growing beneath the surface. The third thing God's real plan looks like is a timeline that does not consult your feelings. 70 years. That is what God told the exiles. Not 7, not 17, 70. Let that number sink in, because it is not abstract. For a person who was 30 years old when they arrived in Babylon, 70 years means they would die in exile. They would never see Jerusalem again. They would plant gardens and build houses and raise children and grow old and die in the very city they had prayed every day to leave. And yet God called them to hope, not to denial, not to pretending the pain was not real, but to a genuine, costly, eyes-wide-open hope that persisted not because they could see the end, but because they trusted the one who held the end in his hands. God told them the number, 70 years, not to devastate them, but to invite them into a different relationship with time, his time. Because here is what that timeline reveals about how God operates. He is not managing your comfort, he is managing your formation. And formation does not happen on the timeline you would choose if you were in charge. It happens on the timeline that produces the depth of character, the quality of faith, the capacity for trust that God knows you will need for what comes next. You may be in a season right now where the timeline feels cruel, where you have waited long enough, where your patience has run out and your hope is threadbare, and you genuinely do not know how much longer you can hold on. And what I want to say to you with everything in me is this: you may be building something you will never get to live in, and that is still part of God's plan. The exiles who died before the return to Jerusalem were not forgotten. They were not wasted. Their faithfulness across decades of waiting was the foundation on which the return was built. Your faithfulness right now, in this season, is building something whose full significance you may not live to see. And that is not a tragedy. That is one of the most sacred ways a human life can be spent. The fourth thing God's real plan actually looks like is intimacy, not just rescue. Most people who cling to Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11 stop reading at verse 11, but what comes immediately after is the part that changes the entire meaning of the promise. Jeremiah chapter 29 verses 12 and 13 say this: "Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." Notice the structure. God gives the promise of a future and a hope, and then he immediately tells them what that future is rooted in: a relationship, a seeking, a turning toward him with the whole heart, not just in moments of crisis, not just when the pain is fresh and the desperation is high, but as a sustained, daily, wholehearted pursuit of God himself. This is where the vending machine theology completely breaks down. Because vending machine theology says the goal is the outcome. Pray until the circumstances change. Believe until the blessing arrives. But what God is saying here is something categorically different. He is saying, the goal is me. The future and the hope I am promising you are rooted not in improved circumstances, but in a deepened relationship with the God who holds all circumstances in his hands. The exile was designed, among other things, to produce a people who sought God not because their life was comfortable, but because he was worth seeking, regardless of how their life looked. And that is still what God is doing in the hard seasons of your life today. He is not primarily trying to fix your circumstances. He is trying to have you, fully, completely, without the distractions and the self-sufficiency that prosperity can quietly produce. He is not trying to fix your life. He is trying to have your life. The fifth thing God's real plan looks like is a story bigger than your personal chapter. When God promised a future and a hope to the exiles in Babylon, that promise was pointing far beyond the historical return to Jerusalem that happened 70 years later. The return from exile was a fulfillment, yes, but it was not the fulfillment. The prophets who came after Jeremiah, men like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Zechariah, made clear that the restoration God was ultimately promising required something far greater than a geopolitical event. It required a redeemer. It required someone who could deal not just with the external exile of a nation, but with the internal exile of every human heart separated from God by sin. The future and hope of Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11 finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. In the cross, where God absorbed the full weight of exile on behalf of every human being who had ever felt displaced, forgotten, or abandoned. In the resurrection, where God proved that no story, however broken, is beyond the reach of his redemptive power. In the promise of a new creation, where every exile ends, every tear is accounted for, and every act of faithfulness in the darkness is finally and fully vindicated. What that means for you is this: your pain, as real as it is not the whole story. Your current chapter, as long and as hard as it feels, is not the main story. You are part of something so vast, so ancient, so cosmically significant that the full meaning of what God is doing in your life will not be visible until eternity. Your suffering has weight. Your faithfulness has meaning. Your story is held in the hands of a God whose plan stretches from before the foundation of the world to the last page of human history. And not one moment of your exile is outside the reach of that plan. These 5 things: displacement before destination, faithfulness in the wrong place, a timeline that does not consult your feelings, intimacy over rescue, and a story bigger than your personal chapter are not theological abstractions. They are the lived experience of every man and woman in Scripture who trusted God through the dark. And they are the framework through which God wants you to read your own life right now. But I know that frameworks are not always enough. I know that there is someone watching right now who has heard everything we have covered, who believes it is true, who wants to hold on to it, and who still feels completely, utterly lost. And that person deserves more than 5 points. That person deserves an honest conversation. So that is exactly what we are going to have right now. The honest conversation. What to do when you cannot feel the plan. Let me step away from the framework for a moment. Let me put down the theology and the historical context and the 5 points, and just talk to you directly. Because I think there is someone watching this right now who needs something different from what the last section offered. Not more information, not another principle to write down. Just someone willing to tell the truth about what it actually feels like when God's plan is invisible, and the silence is deafening, and the waiting has gone on so long that hope itself feels like a cruel joke. Maybe that is you right now. And if it is, I want you to know that what I am about to say is not a detour from this message. It is the heart of it. You have done everything right. Let me say that again because I need you to actually hear it. You have done everything right. You prayed, you fasted, you served, you gave when you did not have enough. You showed up to church when you did not feel like it. You chose forgiveness when bitterness would have been easier. You kept believing when every circumstance told you to stop. And your life still looks nothing like what you were promised. The doors are still closed. The healing has not come. The relationship is still broken. The prodigal has not come home. The dream is still buried. And nobody gave you a letter. Nobody told you how long this would last. Nobody sat down with you and said, here is the timeline. Here is what this season is building. Here is the exact purpose behind every painful day of this. You have just been living it, day after day, with nothing but silence from the God you have been faithful to. I need to say 3 things to you, and I need you to receive them not as pastoral platitudes, but as hard-won truth. The first thing is this: lament is not the opposite of faith. It is one of the deepest expressions of it. People in the church have been told, sometimes explicitly and sometimes through the culture of relentless positivity that fills our sanctuaries and our social media feeds, that grief is a sign of weak faith, that if you are really trusting God, you will be peaceful, you will be joyful, you will have a testimony ready to share with a smile. And if you are honest about your pain, if you cry out to God with raw, unfiltered anguish, somehow that reflects poorly on your relationship with Him, that is not biblical. That is not even close to biblical. God did not just permit lament in Scripture, He canonized it. He put an entire book of lamentations in the middle of the Bible. Jeremiah, the same prophet who carried the letter of Jeremiah chapter 29, also wrote Lamentations chapter 3 verses 1 through 3, where he said, I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. That is not a man who has lost his faith. That is a man whose faith was deep enough to be honest with God about his suffering. The Psalms are full of this. David crying out that God has hidden his face. Habakkuk demanding that God explain himself. Job refusing to offer his friends the tidy, comfortable answers they kept pushing on him, and instead bringing his raw, broken, furious grief directly to God. And in every single one of those cases, God did not rebuke their honesty. He honored it. Your grief is not evidence that God has failed you. Your grief is evidence that you are human, that you loved something deeply, that you trusted God with something that mattered, and that the waiting is real and the pain is real. Honest grief is not spiritual weakness. It is spiritual maturity. It is the mark of a person who is willing to be real with God rather than performing a version of faith designed to impress other people. The second thing I need to say is this. Confusion about God's plan does not disqualify you from it. One of the quieter lies that circulates in Christian culture is the idea that clarity is a sign of spiritual health and confusion is a sign of spiritual failure. That if you really knew God, if your faith was really strong, you would have a clear sense of direction, a confident understanding of what He is doing, a peace that makes perfect sense of your circumstances. And if you are confused, if you genuinely cannot see what God is doing or why, that somehow reflects a deficiency in your relationship with Him. Abraham left everything he knew to go to a place God had not yet shown him. That is not a metaphor. He literally packed up his entire life and started walking without a destination. And Hebrews chapter 11 verse 8 says, he went out not knowing where he was going. Moses led millions of people through a wilderness for 40 years with no GPS, no guaranteed water source, and a God whose instructions he often did not fully understand. The disciples walked with Jesus for 3 years and still did not fully grasp what he was doing until after the resurrection. Confusion is not the exception in the life of faith. Confusion is the normal experience of following a God whose ways, as Isaiah chapter 55 verse 9 says, are higher than your ways, and whose thoughts are higher than your thoughts. The architecture of faith was never designed to produce certainty about circumstances. It was designed to produce trust in a person. And those are profoundly different things. You do not need to understand what God is doing in your life right now. You need to trust the one who does. That trust is not naive. It is not the absence of questions. It is the decision, made daily, sometimes hourly, to keep your hand in the hand of a God whose character you know even when you cannot trace his ways. The third thing I want to say is perhaps the most important of all, and I want you to hear it as personally as I can possibly say it. The fact that you are still here matters more than you know. You are still watching. You are still listening. You are still asking questions about God's plan for your life. You have not walked away. You have not hardened your heart. You have not decided that God is a fiction, or that faith is a waste, or that the whole thing was a beautiful lie you told yourself in easier times. You are still here, still seeking, still hoping, even if the hope feels thin and fragile and nothing like what it used to feel. That is not nothing. That is everything. Because here is the truth that the exile teaches us, the truth that is woven through every story of faithful suffering in the entire biblical narrative. The opposite of faith is not doubt. Doubt and faith have lived together in the same human heart since the beginning. The opposite of faith is departure. It is the decision to stop seeking, stop trusting, stop showing up. And you have not made that decision. Even on the days when it would have been completely understandable to make it, you have not made it. That persistence, that stubborn, quiet refusal to let go of God even when you could not feel him, is itself the work of God in you. It is the evidence that the plan is still active, still moving, still accomplishing something you cannot yet see. The fact that you are still here means something. It means the story is not over. It means the letter has not said everything it has to say to you yet, but staying here, remaining faithful in the exile, requires something specific. It requires a different kind of trust than the one most of us started with. Not the trust that says, God will fix this soon, but the trust that says, God is present in this, purposeful in this, and faithful through this, regardless of how long it lasts or how it ends. And that shift from cheap hope to costly trust is what we are going to talk about right now. The call to a different kind of trust. There is a version of trust that most of us begin our faith journey with. It is genuine. It is sincere. It is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. It is the trust that says, God is good, and because God is good, things will work out the way I hope they will. It is the trust that is fueled by expectation, sustained by visible progress and quietly dependent on circumstances trending in the right direction. And it works beautifully, right up until the moment life stops cooperating. What Jeremiah's letter demands from the exiles, and what God is asking of you right now, is a fundamentally different kind of trust. Not a trust that is contingent on the outcome. Not a trust that says, "I believe you, God, as long as this resolves the way I need it to." But a trust that has looked the full cost of the exile in the face, counted the years, felt the weight of the displacement, and chosen to plant a garden anyway. That is costly trust. And it is the only kind of trust that can carry a human being through 70 years of waiting. The shift from cheap hope to costly trust is not a single dramatic moment. It is a series of smaller decisions made in the ordinary, unglamorous hours of everyday life. And I want to walk you through what those decisions actually look like, because this is where everything we have covered today has to land in real, practical terms. The first decision is to change the question you are bringing to God. Most of us, when we are in a hard season, bring God one question above all others: when will you fix this? It is the most natural question in the world. It is the question the exiles were asking. It is the question every human being asks when the pain stretches beyond what feels bearable. And there is nothing wrong with asking it. But if it is the only question you are asking, it will eventually hollow you out, because it frames your entire relationship with God around a timeline He has not committed to giving you. The question that actually produces transformation is different. It is not, "When will you fix this?" but "What are you forming in me through this?" That single shift in posture changes everything, because "when will you fix this?" makes God's faithfulness contingent on a schedule. But "what are you forming in me through this?" opens your eyes to the reality that God is already at work, already active, already doing something significant in the very season you have been treating as a waste. The second decision is to separate understanding the plan from trusting the planner. These are two completely different things, and conflating them is one of the most common reasons believers hit a wall in their faith. You do not need to understand what God is doing in order to trust that He is doing something. You do not need a clear map of the next 5 years to take the next faithful step today. The exiles in Babylon did not have a detailed blueprint of how the next 70 years would unfold. They had a letter. They had a word from a God whose track record they knew. And that was enough to plant gardens, build houses, and raise children in a foreign land. Trust in the planner means you have studied the character of God carefully enough that His past faithfulness becomes the foundation for your present confidence. Not confidence that everything will resolve on your timeline. Confidence that the one who held the exiles through 70 years of displacement, who sustained Joseph through years in a prison cell, who carried David through years of running for his life, is the same God who is carrying you through this. His character has not changed. His capacity has not diminished. And His commitment to the people He loves has never once been revoked. The third decision is the one that will cost you the most, and it is the one that will produce the most. It is the decision to stop waiting for this season to be over before you give God your full worship, your full presence, and your full obedience. The exiles were not told to worship in Jerusalem by memory and mark time until they could get back. They were told to seek the welfare of Babylon, to pray for it, to invest in it, to be fully present in the very place they most wanted to leave. That is the invitation God is extending to you today. Not to pretend the pain is not real, not to manufacture a joy you do not feel, but to refuse to put your life, your faith, your generosity, and your worship on hold until circumstances improve. To seek God with your whole heart, not when this is over, but while this is happening. Because the person you become by seeking God faithfully through the exile is not the same person who went in. And that transformation, that deepening, that forging of a character that can carry the weight of what God has planned for your life. That is what the exile was always for. There were exiles in Babylon who planted gardens and never ate the fruit, who built houses and died before the decree of Cyrus sent their children home, who prayed for the welfare of a city they would never see restored to peace. And they did it anyway. Not because they could see the end, but because they trusted the God who held the end in his hands, and because they were faithful to the process, their children came home. Your obedience today is not just for you. The faithfulness you choose in this season, the trust you extend to God in this particular exile, the seeds you plant in soil that may feel barren and hostile and wrong, those seeds are producing something that may take longer than your lifetime to fully emerge, something that the people who come after you will benefit from in ways you cannot imagine. Sometimes your obedience today is the miracle someone else will experience tomorrow. That is the call, not to feel better, not to understand more, but to trust more deeply, to seek more honestly, and to plant more faithfully, right here, right now, in the exact place you are standing. And that brings us to the place where we started this conversation, back to the person at 3 in the morning, reaching for a verse that they had quoted 100 times but never fully understood. And I want to close by going back to that moment one final time, because what we say to that person now is different from anything we could have said at the beginning of this video. That person at 3 in the morning, lying in the dark, phone in hand, typing into a search bar the most honest question they have ever asked. Does God still have a plan for my life? Deserves a real answer. Not a quote, not a wallpaper, not a verse stripped of its context and packaged into something comfortable. A real answer, rooted in the full weight of what God actually said and what it actually cost to say it. So here is the real answer. Yes, God still has a plan for your life, but the plan looks like Babylon before it looks like Jerusalem. It looks like a letter before it looks like a rescue. It looks like planting a garden in a city you never chose, in a season you never wanted, for a future you may not live to see. It looks like 70 years on a timeline that does not consult your feelings. It looks like praying for the welfare of the very circumstances that broke you. It looks like seeking a God who feels silent, with the same wholehearted intensity you would bring to seeking him if he felt near. That is not the version of the promise that sells coffee mugs, but it is the version that has carried human beings through the worst that life can deliver for thousands of years without failing once. The exiles who received Jeremiah's letter did not get what they wanted. They got something better. They got a God who refused to lie to them about how long it would take, refused to offer them the comfort of a false prophet's easy promise, and instead gave them something that cheap hope could never produce, a faith forged in the fire of real waiting, real loss, and real faithfulness, a faith that held not because circumstances cooperated, but because the God behind the promise was, and is, and always will be, exactly who he said he is. Finally, this is what I want to leave with you. Not a feeling, not a momentary wave of encouragement that fades by tomorrow morning, but a posture, a permanent reorientation toward the God who knows the plans he has for you, not as a slogan to quote when life gets hard, but as a foundation to stand on when everything else has given way. Plant the garden, build the house, seek the welfare of the city, pray without ceasing. Trust the planner when you cannot see the plan, and refuse with every fiber of your being to let the silence of the exile convince you that the author of the story has forgotten the chapter you are in. He has not forgotten, he never has, he never will. If this message reached something real in you today, drop a comment below and tell me what season of Babylon you are walking through right now. You are not alone in it, and your honesty might be exactly what someone else in this community needs to read today. If you know someone who is in the middle of a hard season, someone who is lying awake at night asking the same question that started this video, share this with them. Not because it will make the pain disappear, but because the truth we walked through today was built to hold the weight of exactly what they are carrying. And if you want to go deeper into the passages and the stories that have shaped everything we talked about today, subscribe and stay close, because the next message we are going into is one that permanently changed the way I read every hard season I have ever walked through, and I believe it will do the same for you.